Verse seems to work, okay? And let's start. Today, the lecture is going to be about the invasion of Italy. I'm not going to take it to the conclusion, 1945, but we're going to get well into 1944 with us. I want to put a fundamental question in front of everyone, not to look for an answer, but just to contemplate. And that is, well, two questions. Why did Italy join Germany? And then why ultimately did Italy surrender? Now that seems to be pretty obvious in some ways, but I think the fundamental question goes a bit differently if we put it in this context. If you're going to go to war, and that's what you're committing your nation to do, what is the definition you would put forward for victory? And what cost would you be willing to pay to do it, to get there? And the second part of that is, if you're losing, if it seems obvious your goals cannot be accomplished, then what do you do? Now, contrast what happens in, and we talked about this in the Eastern Front in the first lecture, the basic surrender of Bulgaria and Romania to the Russians, and then actually switching sides, not necessarily voluntarily in the usual sense of the word, but at least they did. And why in this situation does Italy surrender, but Japan and Germany do not? Now, you could say that all wars end with a surrender of some sort, and that indeed is the case generally. There's a form of surrender that we could call a formal one, takes place on the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Harbor. But there are other kinds of surrender that take place. And I want us to keep in mind that Italy kind of represents that peculiar duality of joining a conflict for a particular set of reasons. And long after it becomes obvious that whatever the goals were in joining with Germany, those goals were unachievable. And they were perhaps known to be unachievable in 1942, maybe even a bit earlier, maybe mid-42. And yet, we're into this conflict much later before they ultimately give up. Now, we had discussed previously that North Africa had gone under, and the Allies, Britain and England primarily, France was beginning to show presence, but de Gaulle was still a nuisance. And I say that as reflecting what everybody at the time was saying about de Gaulle and what minimal contribution the French were able to offer. But once North Africa goes under, the next set of questions that come up, one goal of which had been established even before of the complete occupation of North Africa, was where do you go from there? And that controversy was very evident, particularly between the goals of the United States and Britain. Now, this gives us a picture, in a sense, complicated as it is, and don't expect to worry about the fine print. It shows you basically the occupations that were still under German control, primarily, and the encroachments that were occurring from the Soviet Union and the British and American allies. Turkey and Spain, Portugal had remained neutral. Sweden was neutral, as you see there. In this situation, the question of where do you go from North Africa, to us, in retrospect, may seem very obvious, but I want to point out a couple of things just on this map. Tom may show it a little better. Here's Tunis, all right, May 43. The Axis forces surrender. Here is Sicily. There's Malta. This is Pantelleria, this little spot here, minimally occupied, but when you held it, you could provide a nuisance factor to transits through this narrow portion of the Mediterranean. If you're coming from the Suez Canal down here in the lower right, and you want to transport and go through the Straits of Gibraltar. But notice the position of Sardinia here. And the distance from Tunis to Sardinia is really not much different than the distance to Sicily, okay? When you're looking at using your forces most economically, then the question from a military standpoint becomes, where is the enemy's strength? And what advantages do I gain by contesting against that strength? Or do I look for a position of weakness, which will in effect render that strength in one place, in this case, Sicily, either negated or substantially reduced? Allied intelligence had indicated that, sorry, again, that thing does it. I'm sorry about that. It's amazing how many skips it'll make when you touch it once. When you look at the position here, the Allies were aware that Sardinia and Corsica, compared to Sicily, were relatively poorly defended. So why go after strength? Now, when I talked about the Pacific campaign last time, and I raised the question of why to attack Tarawa, and in that atoll, while there was, in my interpretation, a good reason to attack at Tarawa, the question was, why attack the island of Beisho when Bukariki was undefended and of comparable size? Why not go up there 20 miles away? Think about, you're in Binghamton on Beisho, and somebody's in Owego, and up there, there's very little defense, whereas you've built your defensive structures here. Why wouldn't you go up to Owego where it's an easy take? And there are questions here which have to be answered in part because I'm not disparaging the intelligence or wisdom of the decisions. I'm just trying to point out to all of us, even when we think about conflicts today, that we put ourselves not just in the position of accepting what people have said, even people at the highest levels of authority, but we look at it and think to ourselves, was there an easier route? Was there something else we could do? So I raise that as a point of interest, and we'll cover it a little more deeply when we get to the actual actions. I mention this because at this particular point in the war, it was pretty clear to the Allies and to the Soviet Union they were not going to lose. Just as I spoke in the past about Japan saying they're not going to win after Guadalcanal. They're not sure they're going to lose, but they no longer feel they're going to win, whatever that really means in terms of your overall strategic goals. Similarly with Germany, it was pretty clear, especially after Kursk, which we talked about in the past, that famous battle in July of '43, which the Soviets defeated within a matter of days and forced the Germans well back, literally several hundred miles with their counteroffensives. It was pretty clear to Germany they weren't going to win according to the definition of victory they had established for themselves when they first invaded the Soviet Union in '41. That no longer was achievable, and everybody knew it, including Hitler. All right. Now, Hitler was beginning to deteriorate a little bit into what I'll call some fantasies about how he could maintain Germany in the war, and made decisions based on those fantasies, which were not good, not useful for the German people as a whole. But the point I'm trying to make here is that when you see this transition occurring in 1943, you begin to see the shifting of attitudes. And that particular change in attitudes does a great deal to determine what you're going to do for the rest of the fighting until peace is achieved.
You've been feeding the chia seeds.
I'm sorry, say again? Tom, did you hear what that was? Somebody asked a question? I guess not.
I guess not. Zoom's all muted.
Okay, fine. If you need to ask a question, you push your space bar on your computer, or there's an icon where you say raise your hand. And that makes Tom aware that you want to ask a question. Okay. So these conferences, why did they matter? What was the importance? What kind of direction did it affect? The Casablanca Conference I talked about briefly in a previous lecture related to the invasion of North Africa and Torch. But here I want to highlight a couple of different elements. First of all, the most important decision of the Casablanca Conference: no invasion of the continent of Europe until 1944. The Americans were incensed by the attitude of the British that somehow or another we wouldn't invade France for yet another year. And we'd been trying to build up resources in England in order to invade the continent and take the war directly to the Germans. But as the British pointed out, and quite rightfully pointed out, the American troops in England, in particular, were poorly trained for the kind of combat they would face. They needed much more training. Secondly, the requirements for a cross-channel invasion in terms of the Navy, the support, the Air Force that you would use to cover that naval fleet that was going to come, was something that was just insufficient to create a landing of such power that once it landed, not only would it be successful in creating a beachhead, but would serve as the starting board for the rest of the conquering of France and Germany, which meant you had to have an enormous backlog of supplies and people and ways to get all the supplies across the channel into France. Because during the course of getting ready for the invasion, as we'll talk about next time, you're bombing a lot of the communication centers, you're blowing up bridges, you're trying your best to destroy the infrastructure on which the Germans rely. But once you get there, you're going to rely on. So you have to have all of the engineering support that you could muster in order to rebuild as quickly as possible. And that lesson was brought home in spades when we talk about Italy. Now, the Mediterranean, Sicily was chosen as the focus. Why? And we'll come to that in particular, but it had to do with, if you don't take Sicily, knowing that Corsica and Sardinia are relatively poorly defended, the Air Force on Sicily can still interdict transit across the Mediterranean much more easily. So you have to have a bombing campaign, if you will, that would obliterate or create air superiority over Sicily, and that would be very hard to maintain because you wanted your strategic bombers doing something else. And that's where we come to part 3. The bomber offensive, which had been gaining power through 42. It had been fairly weak and conducted only by the British in 39, 40, 41. It wasn't until 42 and well into 42 that we had begun to put a presence in England of aircraft capable of performing strategic bombing. We'll talk about that next time in more depth. But by going into Sicily, by getting into perhaps southern Italy, then we would have those long-range bombers that we were creating and bringing over to the old countries, if you will. We could bomb deeper into Germany, particularly if we could get up to what was already recognized as a major air base at a place called Foggia, F-O-G-G-I-A, and my Italian isn't very good. If someone has a better interpretation, that's fine. Now, but if you're going to build up resources in England, you have to win the Battle of the Atlantic. So you have to commit more and more resources there. And we're going to talk about that next week as well. So that is another determination. Now, particularly King, Nimitz, MacArthur, and others are saying, look at the opportunities in the Pacific. We are building up strength. We've already shown that we can drive the Japanese back from powerfully held enclaves. We've been learning great lessons in how to do that. And if we support that Pacific campaign, both from the South Pacific area with MacArthur and the Central Pacific with Nimitz, then we can drive the Japanese further back. And because ultimately those SOBs are the ones who got us in this fighting in the first place. Now, I'm not going to be talking about the China-Burma-India theater until the fall. So I don't want people to think I've forgotten about how important that area is, right? But within the context of what we have available now, this is the focus. Then on top of it, Roosevelt literally walks out of the conference and announces to the press unconditional surrender. He pulls a fast one on Churchill, who kind of looks around and says, we didn't talk about that. And of course, Stalin finally gets word of it. There was no way he was going to arrive in Casablanca with what was going on in late 42 in the Soviet Union. But they hear this and they go, really? What does that mean? That's a whole different definition of victory than what we might have anticipated, more in line with how World War I ended, right? With a few extra modifications in the so-called Versailles Treaty, so we don't allow Germany to have the resurgence it has. But unconditional surrender? Oh man, that sets up a whole different issue. And if you're on the receiving end of that, now suppose you're Mussolini and you say unconditional surrender, what does that mean? That means we don't get any ability to negotiate. You come in and you're going to tell us exactly what to do. And if you come in, you can completely destroy, in a way, our culture, even our people. Because isn't that what unconditional means? So where's the bargaining power to try to end all this killing? And if you wonder about that element and apply it only to this era, you're missing some vital points, because what happens soon after World War II ends? Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, the various Gulf wars that we talk about, and even now the Palestinian issue and the Ukraine. Imagine if one of those proponents said to the opponent, you must surrender unconditionally. Are you going to surrender? Or are you going to stay in the fight until the bitter, bitter end? So those are dynamics that are with us today. Now, the source of it, of his making that comment, is not clear. But for those of you who know Civil War history, Ulysses S. Grant was kind of given the eponym unconditional surrender Grant because of what he did at Fort Donelson when he told Buckner, it's time for you guys to quit. And if you don't quit, we're going to assault your works and we'll take over. Okay. So that's, I suspect, where where Roosevelt got this, and he pulled a fast one. because it established the political conditions, not just the military conditions. In order to achieve the political condition, it means you have to have such a preponderance of military power that your enemy is no longer able to resist. And he's willing to say, we're just done, do what you will. Okay? If the Soviet Union had surrendered due to all the losses it sustained in 1941 in Operation Barbarossa, then you've turned over to Hitler the complete authority to accomplish all of the goals for which he invaded the Soviet Union. He would have carved out an enormous amount of territory, basically said that, and he would enslave and eventually eliminate most of the Slavic inhabitants. He would use them for labor until they no longer needed them, and he had a German population that was adequate to be demographically powerful in those regions. That was his willingness. So think about the effect of unconditional surrender in that situation, okay? Hitler never offered unconditional surrender to the British or even the French, obviously, because when the French surrendered, he gave them half of the country to rule through what was called Vichy France. And he tried to negotiate with Britain to the point where he said, you can even keep your colonies. Okay? The British would have none of it. But that didn't mean that for Churchill and the British people, it meant unconditional surrender of Germany in return. So Roosevelt sticks this political goal in front of the entire world. And it changes the dynamics that occur enormously, in my view. There's another conference that takes place before Sicily is invaded. And it confirmed that not only would Sicily be invaded, but Italy. And I'm going to come to the Sardinia-Corsica part in a little bit. But there's now an additional thing, and that is the second point, that they want to convince Stalin to join the fighting against Japan because they share a land border. And if the Russians are able to put pressure on the Japanese, it'll siphon off resources from the Japanese army at the very least to try to resist the Soviet invasion. But Stalin is well down in the depths of using up most all of his resources. In fact, he has stripped the Far East because he had a negotiated agreement with the Japanese that we're going to remain neutral towards each other in spite of this conflict. And my bigger problem is Germany. And why aren't you guys launching a second front of some power that'll siphon off German divisions and give me a little respite? Even though in 43, it's clear that the Soviet Union is not going to lose. They're not yet sure how they're going to win or what winning will mean. The British and Americans also agree now that the invasion of France will take place in May of 44. Even then, the British were still leery. And this is an important element that is discussed among a number of historians, but doesn't come out in a number of the books that I've put out here in front of everyone. And that is that the British favored something called the indirect approach, whereas the Americans preferred the direct approach. And the indirect approach basically meant a lot of the time hit the enemy where they're weak, make them stretch their resources so that they can't be strong everywhere. And when you determine where they're strong, you hit them where they're weak, because why attack where they're strong? I mean, that just costs you casualties. They learned that at Dieppe in August of 42 when they tried to take that port in a raid. Oops, hitting them where they're strong doesn't work. So we got to hit them where they're weak. Okay, the Americans say the way you win is by defeating your enemy, and if you can break his power, then you win. And the best way to do that is just take him on and be tougher than he is. It's like a boxing match, right? We're going to get in there and we're going to duke it out, but we're going to be better than you. Talking about boxing, you see that Mike Tyson's going back in the ring at 57. He's fighting a guy half his age. Be interesting. Now, the other part that begins to shift, and this becomes a very important element, is the Americans now are achieving material and numerical superiority over the British. The British have been fighting since 1939. They've suffered great casualties throughout, given the population involved, even though many of their soldiers have been recruited from India and other locations. And even the French, when they're joining in, are recruiting from North Africa. But their manpower reserves are dwindling. They have to become much more careful about how they're going to expend lives, because all battles involve that. The United States, on the other hand, has huge resources in manpower. We end up with an army of over 15 million by the end of the war. And we are producing enormous quantities. It's unfathomable how much we produced during the war. I still find those numbers almost inconceivable. Tanks and airplanes and ships and the rest of it is just amazing. But notice on the last one, Churchill and Brooke press for invasion of the Balkans and delay the invasion of France until 45. This is part of their indirect approach, and their feelings were both military and political in this regard. Remember, at this particular junction, 1943, the Atlantic Wall wasn't built, okay? There were actually very rudimentary fortifications along that coastline in France alone, much less Norway. So by this particular juncture, France still looked weak. And the problem for the Americans is the longer you wait, the stronger those defenses will be. There's no way Hitler and his military people, who are very smart folks, are going to say, well, France will never get invaded, or it won't get invaded across the channel. That was pretty obvious to them, right? Whereas the British are saying, gee, if we go into the Balkans where the Germans are relatively weak, remember that Bulgaria and Romania at this time are beginning to totter. They haven't yet given up. Italy's beginning to totter as well. If we go in the Balkans, we've also got Tito's partisans who have basically taken over all of Yugoslavia and are running the country through partisan warfare. They're siphoning off so much from the Germans to try to suppress them. And if we do that, we can also take Greece. And if we take Greece, the Greeks will join us. And it'll help force Turkey to stay neutral at the very worst. Or we might be able to convince Turkey to join us. And that'll create another flank, another opportunity to attack Germany at their weaker points. However, the Americans were just not going to have any part of it. And Brooke really disliked the American leadership. His comments in his diaries and some of his other things are really scathing. So you have to be aware that there are great divergences of opinion. There were different concepts of how things would happen. So Sicily ends up being invaded, and it falls within about a 6-week period of time. But during the course of this particular engagement, even worse than occurred in North Africa, where there were problems between the British and the Americans, here it was highlighted because of two dominating personalities, not at the highest level of leadership. Eisenhower was still there, Alexander was still there, and they worked together very well. But Montgomery and Patton were two egocentric SOBs, and not just for their own self-aggrandizement, although if you don't have ambition as a military leader at this level, then you don't belong there, right? Because you can't do what needs to be done. You can't just sort of sit back and be a nice guy. But in this contest, they found that the animosities that developed between those two leaders really reached almost a boiling point. And if you watch the movie Patton, they only allude to it occasionally. And one of the things that's hard to appreciate, because neither of the actors from Montgomery or Patton have the same voice quality that you hear if you read descriptions of their voices. They tended to be somewhat high-pitched, which already in itself, in this much testosterone run environment, can actually set your hackles up a little bit. I'm not saying this in a disparaging way. I'm just saying this is what sometimes happens. If you go back into the 40s and understand that, I think you'll have a different picture of it. Patton gets relieved because of two incidences in which he slapped soldiers who were in facilities because of what we now call combat fatigue. All right, this isn't PTSD. This is just combat fatigue. You are done. Your nervous system is wrecked. You honestly can't control a lot of what's happening to you. Your brain just can't function that way. And it takes a good deal of time and understanding to get people back into combat. What they found was if soldiers did have this and they rehabilitated them and got them back to their units, they did much better than if you sent them home and said they were not able. Then they tended to deteriorate more because they weren't put back in situations. That's a different medical issue. The Germans ended up saying at this point, and if you read some of the conferences that took place at Hitler's headquarters, it's a fascinating read to find out what they were discussing at the time. Because now Hitler has seen the disruption of what happened in the Soviet Union at Kursk in July, and now he's faced with the invasion of Sicily in July. And he's saying, this doesn't look good. And in addition, the strategic bombing campaign is beginning to gear up. So German cities are getting hit, French railway communications and so on and so forth are getting hit, supply depots are getting hit, your Air Force has taken a beating, and you have to shift fighter aircraft from the Eastern Front to protect the homeland. And the war in the Atlantic is beginning to change. You have no relationship to Japan. You could care less in a way, and you can't help them anyway. So that's a whole different theater of war that has nothing to do with the decisions Hitler has to make. So what does he do? Well, he says, I think, and the German general staff basically agrees, Italy is going to be the next target. They're not ready yet to invade France, but I can't ignore it. And the Balkans represent a real possibility. So I have to get reinforcements down into the Balkans to resist if they try to invade Greece or Albania. Greece possibly, because they control the Mediterranean. And I've got all those islands out there where I've got garrisons. What do I do with them? He puts Rommel in charge of North Italy initially and says, I think our best line of defense is to hold northern Italy. We're going to give up the south because that's where the industry is. And if we hold northern Italy, then that means that all the passageways through the Alps can be blocked off. And it'll be at a certain range for aircraft and so on, where we can have better mustering of our limited resources to intercept Allied aircraft. He's put in charge there, but they also know that Italy is beginning to falter and may surrender. They don't have complete assurance yet, but they know things are happening. And within a short period of time, especially with the arrest of Mussolini, that becomes obvious, right? That the Italians are going to quit the war at the very least. So he has to establish a presence. And in doing this, he sets up a command structure. Now, Kesselring is going to be in charge of the entire southern area, not just Italy alone. And under him, he's going to have different groups, Rommel being one. But after a short period of time, Rommel is moved to the Balkans temporarily to see what the needs are there. And then within a relatively short time, is moved to France, where he's going to start building the Atlantic Wall. Okay? And the other part about the Atlantic Wall is it's not just France. That wall is built all the way from Norway, all the way down along the coastal areas to the coast of Spain. Something like 1,500 miles. Now, they had to concentrate their resources. So what's in the south or what's in Norway is not anywhere near what it is in northern France. But it gives you an idea of the scope of activity that is required and the management skill that it takes to get that done. Weidinghoff is put in charge of the 10th Army, and they're going to be in charge of this lower portion of Italy down in this area. And with Rommel being dispatched, Kesselring is going to be more in immediate control, especially here, but he's responsible for taking care of 10th Army when they get down there. I mention this not because I want you to remember anything of this sort, but for those of you who are interested in history, von Hubert had a great deal of experience in the Eastern Front in particular, Hare a bit less so. But these were very capable people, and Hitler was willing to commit a fair amount of armor down in Italy, even though the terrain in Italy was really poorly set up for armor activity, especially under the doctrines which had governed German armored theory. Big sweeping motions, deep penetrations. You can't do that in Italy, especially in the mountains. But he was willing to commit considerable resources down there. What about on the Allied side? In this situation, Alexander is in charge of the army, if you want to call it that. It's really an army group. And he has reserves that are available that you see here. And above him is Eisenhower, but within a relatively short time, again, Eisenhower is going to be sent to England, and he's going to take over the management of the eventual invasion of France. Patton is gone, as I said, and he's replaced by Mark Clark, not by Bradley. That comes later with Patton. Mark Clark is going to take Fifth Army, which is made up by what I'm showing you over here. And notice that it's a combined force. This is British here, all right? And this is American. So there are two different corps of two different nations that Mark Clark has to manage. And they have different doctrines about how to fight. Over here, Montgomery has 8th Army, and he doesn't have any other attachments. His is a unified command with people who've been under his command since 8th Army was under his command back in Egypt. The reason I bring these to you is that the structure of how this is to be done and the forces that are available for the invasion of Italy, if they had not been used for the invasion of Italy, might have been relatively stagnant. Now, my challenge to that was, especially once you took Sicily and Sardinia and Corsica basically are abandoned by the Axis powers, why not establish a very strong presence on Corsica and Sardinia? And then you can cut off Italy at its neck, right? You remember how it's shaped like a boot with a big sort of flourish on top where the Allies are. If you control those 3 islands, you can basically land anywhere on the Italian coast with air cover. It'll take time to build it up, but you can do it. And you control the sea, so that's not a problem. You can still muster your ships, and there are ports on Sardinia and in Corsica as well. So you can build up supplies, do some refurbishing, re-ammunition, and so on. But again, the decisions were made to behave differently. Now, under 8th Army, as I mentioned, Alfrey stays in place for the 5th Corps for a while. Dempsey goes on to become an army commander when France is invaded. And this shows the basic routes of invasion. Now, what I want to emphasize here for us is this. Italy has this particular shape, and right here, the Straits of Messina are only about 7 miles wide. When the Allies took Sicily, the Germans were able to evacuate most of their soldiers and heavy equipment across to the toe and then move it up to consolidate more up here, because these areas on the heel and the toe were relatively vulnerable from their perspective. They weren't going to abandon them entirely, but they recognized they could do very little to prevent the Allies from gaining hold here and maybe gaining hold here, because you don't need the same kind of landing craft to get across 7 miles of strait than you do if you're going to invade way up here. This transit is way too long, as you can see from the legend down here. So there are certain logistical considerations that play a big role in this setting. Kesselring, in the meanwhile, sets up the following. He's got directions. Hitler wants to protect the industrial north. Rommel, when he was initially given that, thought the defense should be here. Kesselring felt, look, this is awful terrain for anyone to advance through. Mountains give the defender the predominance of power, even if he's numerically weaker, because the crossing points are a problem. And in addition, what is the direction of flow of any river off the mountains? It's not north-south, right? It's going to be east-west, which means that any advance has to cross river after river after river after river, because they're running perpendicular to the direction of your attack. So that gives the defender yet another advantage. He's got to cross a moat. And even if he lays bridges down, bridges are narrow compared to having a wide area over which you can assault. Mountains have passes. Yes, there might be roads, but in Italy in 1943-44, their road network is very primitive, except for major roads along the coasts. But in the interior, this is pretty much garbage roadways, all right? Now, as a result, Kesselring gets enough support from Hitler to start creating defense lines. Now, notice how far north he's willing to establish them. They want to hang on to Rome if they can, as a political center, but as a morale builder, even though they begin to realize that Badoglio, who's taken over for Mussolini when he's fired, has been talking to the emperor, the king of Italy, basically, and saying, we got to find a way out of this fight, all right? And indeed, the Italians will surrender soon after the invasion. The Americans, taking their usual approach, this is more an indirect approach. I'm going to hit the enemy where they're weak, and we're going to advance up against them. The Americans say, we're going to go into an area we think is relatively weak, but it's closer to the main defenses that we know the Germans are putting together. But if we get in there and we beat them at this level, then we might be able to just push right through here, because they'll have lost so much in trying to fight us off here. And again, we'll see the importance of that in just a little bit. The landings that take place, as I'll show you here at Salerno, demonstrate several things. One is the number of troops that are involved. When we talked about the invasion of Tarawa, we talked about there being maybe 20,000 Marines and Army, maybe a bit more, who were involved in the fighting of the islands that we discussed last time. Here you have much larger numbers, and you have a much more complicated arrangement that has to be established for you to get there and land. The other part is that, unlike in the Pacific, you don't have reefs that you have to worry about. So you can use different kinds of landing craft. Indeed, they did have landing craft that actually had wheels as well, and could literally use a propeller to drive them through the water, and then have the wheels take over when they get on land and start moving inland. unlike the tracked vehicles, the LVTs that we talked about last time. So your whole structure, your whole organization is different. Now, the other part to keep in mind here is this. You're talking about 5 miles here, all right? So if you mark from here all the way down to here, all right, you can see that this is more than landing on Bayshore, where you've got about 1,000, 1,500 yards of frontage. Okay, you're talking 20, 25, maybe more miles. And when you're landing, your initial landings are separate from each other. You have 4 different landing areas. They're separate. Why? Well, in part, you have the Sella River here, which separates these two and naturally cuts across your lines. But secondly, because of the organization and the naval support that's required in setting up how this is all going to occur, the expectation is once you've penetrated here and here in particular, the consolidation effort to this point should be relatively easy. However, as with most conflicts, the Germans had something to say about it. This attack here and here was designed to prevent any enfilade from German positions up here, where they might have relatively strong artillery, which could then attack across here and at least damage the naval support that is here. So this attack was done to not just take Salerno, which in itself was a relatively small town at the time, but more importantly, to just gain control of this flank so the Germans would not be able to use their artillery to attack. The Germans, however, had all this lovely mountainous area here and down here, with the plains relatively open, Notice there's still considerable hills, and some of them are over 1,200 feet in height. So they're not little bumps in the road. They've got pretty good defensive positions, but they haven't really had any time to fortify because they didn't know where exactly the Allies were going to land. So when they do, the high ground overlooking the beaches gives them the possibility of seeing where the Allied forces are. It gives them the possibility of directing artillery fire onto concentrations. And there's even a bit of room for armor in this region here. Now, you can't get big, large armored units, but you can at least use your armor much more effectively in those regions, and that's what they do. When the attacks take place, beginning on the 9th, and I put this legend down here of 5 miles because there wasn't a legend included, it gives you an idea of what's going on in this beachhead as the Allies begin to establish themselves. But also notice that it takes a couple of days for these lines to be consolidated. And in the meantime, you'll see these black arrows that indicate how the Germans were beginning to counterattack. And this symbol is armor, all right? This is armored infantry here, okay? You're bringing power down and you're trying to catch these guys before they can consolidate their bridgehead, bring in armor of their own, and set up enough artillery positions and anti-tank positions from a defensive standpoint to hold off the German counterattacks. And there was one quip I saw ages ago where the Allied troops are coming in and they hear this loudspeaker scream out to them, "Come on in, we've got you covered." And that's about how it felt. From an emotional standpoint, nothing that can be ignored in conflicts of any particular site, but in an emotional conflict, when you're coming onto a beach and you're looking up at hills and you know the enemy is up there and he can see you, but you can't see him. and he's got weapons that can fire down on you. And you may be able to get up there, but you don't have good targets. And that is going to undermine your morale considerably when the shells start falling. And that begins to accrue to the importance of the unit commanders at all levels, who are not only responsible for getting them ashore and keeping them there with the proper supplies, but having them contest against that high ground. And as you can see here in this section, where the ground is relatively open, the Allies are making some advances here, all right? But you'll also notice, I pointed out that this symbol is armor. This symbol is infantry, okay? Infantry in the Allied forces did have some tanks attached to them, but they were not what we call armor heavy. And what you need armor for is the same way you needed battleships at sea. Battleships fight battleships. Armor fights armor, right? You don't want to be stuck out there on your own. Things began to get pretty desperate within a few days. And as the situation morphed, and I go into this detail for the following reason that I'll explain in just a moment, there's considerable fighting over several days. Remember, they land on the 9th. This is the end at 4 days later. How far have they penetrated? Here's a legend that I created to give you an estimate of distance. Maybe 7 miles? Okay, 7 miles. How many yards is that? When you start putting it in that regard, 1,760 yards, we just make it easy and call it 14,000 yards, all right? Not a long distance, correct? My math all right there? Artillery can fire 25,000 yards. So their artillery, the German artillery, can be way back here, pummeling you down here. Pretty bitter stuff. The villages don't provide a great deal of defensive strength, though they are stumbling blocks, and partly because of the road systems that go through them. But what we're seeing is that the main reason the Allies are able to hang on, and that is really the case for those first couple of days, is because of the naval gunfire support. Now, when you've got a battleship that can fire 25,000 or 30,000 yards, then that can be of great help. Even a destroyer with 5-inch guns might reach out 8,000 yards, 9,000 yards. So if they get in close because of the shallow draft on a destroyer, they can provide more accurate fire here. And that's indeed what happened in Sicily. Yes.
The one arm you haven't discussed at all is the air arm.
Correct.
You need air superiority to pull off a landing. Where were the Allied air bases?
Yes.
And where were the German response bases?
The German response bases were further back in the interior along major cities like Foggia near Rome and Naples and places like that, where there was relatively flat ground. Many of the air bases in Sicily, remember, Sicily is finally conquered in the middle of August, and this takes place about 3 weeks later. So you haven't built up the airfields to quite the same degree that you would normally have for an invasion of this sort. So they're flying from North Africa in part, which means their time over Salerno is relatively limited in terms of their range. They can't linger as much. So it's not a matter of sending fighter aircraft over, for example, and saying, cover our troops for the next 2 hours, okay? So the Germans are going to be fended off. All right, but in addition, the German air forces were struggling because of the losses on the Eastern Front and the need to send reinforcements to Germany because of the strategic bombing effect. And we hadn't yet by 43 built up a sufficient bomber force as such. B-26s, as an example, are not as big as the B-17s or the Liberators or some of the British aircraft, the de Havilland and others. They just didn't have the numbers. So air support, interestingly, was less a factor. And most of the histories reflect that. Indeed, the Germans also unleashed something not seen before. And that was a radio-guided bomb. They literally were able to design a bomb that had fins on it that could be maneuvered and adjusted by radio. You could call this, for example, the first precision weapon. They didn't have many of them, but when they got through, they generally did a great deal of damage. And there's a famous photograph of a transport ship, and I believe it was an ammunition ship, that got hit by it and blew up. It's a spectacular image. I don't think I included it here.
The control was back in the mother plane.
Yep. And then, of course, once you had to linger in order to direct it, you didn't have a laser guidance or anything of that sort. So you had to kind of figure out, get your 3D perception right. But the point was, if you hit something, you know, there's just no way to prevent it. You didn't have a response. There was nothing you could do about it. It's coming your way. You can't shoot it because you really can't see it.
And we effectively had no carriers.
The carriers we had were relatively small by comparison in terms of the number of aircraft they could carry. And again, were primarily fighter aircraft, and there was concerns about risking them, you know, things of that nature. So you don't hear much about that. Samuel Eliot Morison has written out of his 15 volumes on the naval history of World War II, is devoted a volume to it, though, to Sicily, Italy, and so on. So over time, over these 4 days, these major attacks that you see taking place really threaten the Allies as they're landing. And in fact, you'll see here that a parachute division is actually landed on the beach area in order to provide resources to help hold the Germans off, keep the defense from collapsing. And eventually, by the 13th and getting a little bit later, they'd begun to consolidate a bridgehead, but it is still relatively shallow. Now, when we come to Anzio, you'll realize certain similarities. And we'll talk about them in just a little bit, but I want to go through this part and then we'll take a short break. Yes.
How were they resupplied? I don't see any major ports.
No, they weren't. They were supplied over the beach, and they had the Higgins boats as one. The LSTs were still not quite ready to land on shore the way you see them in 1944, even though they would have been capable of doing it. But the beachhead is so shallow that even if they'd gotten there, they would have been shot up pretty badly. So small landing craft, lighters they're called many times, are taking supplies off the naval transports and are running them into shore. They're unloading them. That all takes bodies because they don't have any mechanical implements. They're really helping them do that. And then they all have to almost literally be manhandled to where you want to use them, because the number of trucks you can load in this particular congested beachhead is relatively limited. And trucks, as you know, are extremely vulnerable to artillery fire. So you have all that. Similarly, and I mentioned this because of this importance, and I showed this in a previous slide, here on the 3rd of September, so almost a week before the 5th Army invades here, Montgomery's taking his 8th Army across the Straits of Messina, and he's working his way up to join eventually with 5th Army, and then they'll drive north, as you'll see here, to this final line, which takes place in October. Montgomery's mindset was conditioned in good measure by his past history of experiences. Remember, he'd been involved in the 1940 fighting in France and had been evacuated and then spent time defending southern England, building that up. And then when he'd gone to the Eighth Army in Cairo in Egypt and took over from Wavell, I think it was at the time, I always get, no, Auchinleck at the time. He knew that he had to protect his soldiers and he had to build up such an enormous amount of power that he could be pretty much guaranteed he would be successful in his offensive actions. He refused to let anyone push him, whether it was Churchill or Alexander or Brooke, with whom he was good friends, or anyone else. His constant philosophy was, I'm going to clean up the battlefield, I'm going to organize it, and I'm going to function in a methodical fashion, bringing immense power to bear. What happened when he took the landing on the Toe was very similar to what happened in North Africa once he had won the battle at El Alamein, and he's now chasing the Germans across North Africa. He's very methodical. So he never catches up to the Germans the way the British caught up to the Italians in 1940 at Beta Front, where they had trapped them against the sea and basically eliminated through POWs of over 100,000 Italians. So he's going very methodically through here, and you'll see from some of these dates, this is the 15th of September. Remember, they land here on the 9th. They basically can get to here by about the 13th, and they're basically stalled there for another week or so. And Montgomery, facing much less defense, but again, lousy terrain and a very methodical approach, is able to move up so that a week after Salerno, he's here. Now, what happened over here? They landed a British airborne division. They landed them by sea. They didn't land on as paratroopers, all right? But this is the first airborne division called the Red Devils. They land here, and the Germans had basically abandoned this area. They had no reason to stay here. So delaying actions were fought so that by the 14th of September, they're beginning to drive up along that east coast. Finally, they join up with Montgomery's 8th Army. They become a consolidated unit, and then the 8th Army shifts over towards the east while the 5th Army is driving up towards the west. And remember, the 5th Army has a British corps as well as an American corps. So the predominant numbers are still British, not Americans. A lot of Americans have been going to England. They're not as powerful here. They will become that as we go on. And as we get into September and later, and we'll take our break here in just a moment, the Allies finally, by consolidating the 8th Army and the 5th Army, are able to establish a continuous line across Italy and begin their drive north. Let's take a break for 5 minutes, bathroom break, whatever, stretch. And I'll certainly, if anyone in Zoom land or any of you have questions, feel free to ask. I have over here a series of different maps that have different scales. They represent different things that you can see. Up here, a series of books that I use for lectures of this sort. The one without the cover is free for anyone to take. It's actually written by an excellent historian, Martin Blumenson. So it's actually a very good history if you're interested. Okay, let's take a few minutes. And Tom, we've been recording the whole time, right?
Yeah.
It's always unimportant.
I forgot to ask.
A lot of these, right? My son sent it to me. There's a whole site where you can put in a name.
Oh,
Get the
Yeah.
clue.
379th Bomb Group. Really?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's
Isn't that
fantastic.
great?
That's great.
Where's Mark Clark at this time?
He became the army commander of Fifth Army. He had moved up from a corps command. And remember, Patton was in charge of the American forces in North Africa. Mark Clark was one of his subordinates. And Clark had basically ascended to the Fifth Army Command when Patton got kicked out and sent back to England in disgrace.
Yeah. And what is about the date?
Oh, the date for Clark is, I think, July or August.
Oh, that early.
Yeah,
Okay.
August yeah, it's actually after Sicily falls.
Okay.
Because Patton was still in charge of his units up until Sicily surrendered. But almost immediately afterward, Patton is kicked out and Clark is put in command. Now, the interesting part then is they're only about 3 to 4 weeks before they're going to invade Italy. And that's a huge requirement. It's a huge requirement to step up another level
Yeah.
and begin to comprehend all the stuff that's going on that's your responsibility. Yeah. It's amazing what people can adjust to, but you know, the one extraordinary example that I always think about in that regard is General Meade in the Civil War, all right, replaced Joe Hooker 3 days before Gettysburg. So he was,
Time to organize.
yeah, and he's got, you know, suddenly he's in charge of the whole Army of the Potomac. Yeah.
I got a question. The very first of these talks, you mentioned that Finland was with the Germans. I had no idea.
Yes,
Never, ever heard that.
yes, the reasons were several. One is that the Russians or the Soviets had invaded Finland in 1939 when they Stalin demanded Finland give up the Karelia Peninsula and other territories close to Leningrad. And the Finns refused. So he launched an attack in 39, which was beaten off by the Finns and devastating losses to the Soviets. It's one of the things Hitler paid great attention to. But he mustered more troops and finally, in early 1940, forced the Finns to give up those territories. Finland was really pissed. So Germany made overtures to Finland and said, you know, if we get into a fight with the Soviets, would you be willing to join us and take back territories that you've lost? So they worked out agreements. And when Germany controlled Norway, Sweden maintaining its neutrality, Finland's thinking, I think the Germans got this. But the Finns did something unusual as far as Germany was concerned. They only advanced to their old borders of 39. So they didn't make the final plunge to link up with the German forces and actually completely surround Leningrad. And in the further north, and even in central Finland, any attacks that took place were so logistically difficult that they made very little progress. They had tried, the Germans had even sent forces up there. There's a book on it that is very interesting as to how they wanted to take some of the major ports because they could cut the White Sea off and no supplies could get around the North Cape and get down to Murmansk and Archangel.
So how much of a nuisance was Finland to the convoys?
It was enough of a nuisance to the Russians that they had to commit troops there. But once they recognized the Finns weren't going to be very aggressive, and they said, okay, we can deal with them later. And indeed they did when they finally broke the siege of Leningrad. Then part of it, we always talk about the Germans being thrown back. But part of it was that the Russians, the Soviets, were able to force the Finns back and the Finns had to sue for peace. And when they did that, eventually the Finns said to the Germans, you got 2 weeks to get out of here. And the Germans in the north went to Norway. The Germans who were in the south and middle areas had great difficulty because they had to traverse the whole length of Finland to get to Norway because they couldn't go across the Baltic because that was all under Soviet control.
Oh, okay, well, that's the whole thing. That's
Yeah.
completely missed.
Yeah, it's a fascinating time.
The Mediterranean France was all Vichy, wasn't it?
Yes,
And would
until,
Sardinia provide a gateway for invasion of France that would be much more favorable, I think, make the Germans very nervous.
that was my thought. Similarly, if you put a substantial force in Corsica and Sardinia, you've got northern Italy that's, available to you, and you've got southern France. And he's got to work to protect that, especially southern France, because it had been under Vichy control. And it was only taken over by the Germans later to prevent the French fleet. Once Vichy surrendered in North Africa, that's when Hitler came down and said, you got to take the rest of France because we can't let the French fleet at Toulon fall into Allied hands. The French,
My son found this.
for reasons to this day I don't understand, once they saw what was happening, I would have thought the French fleet would have left Toulon and gone over to the Allies. They didn't. They didn't. I mean, it's just, at times you just scratch your head over it and say, what were you thinking?
That's very long time.
Okay, yeah, I noticed your absence.
So I did watch the Zoom recording.
Okay,
Not the same.
not the same. It is.
Yeah, all that.
I know. What happened was the battery died
Yes, you did.
and I had no idea.
A lot more than we did.
So we're talking away and finally somebody says, we can't hear you.
Yes.
I looked and it's red. I, what the heck? And I turn it and it stayed green for about 10 seconds and then went red.
But she didn't.
So
get
that
the-
we always
the,
end up with something.
clouds coming. She was saying to Monday night, and it came out. Yes, when we were
Yeah.
driving. north,
These have been
about
very good.
5.
Oh, they do a great job. Yeah.
Something we set off.
Yeah.
You know, where the Sarah-
What do you want?
Right,
Right?
going up there, when you're going towards the witch. Yeah. By the time we were getting there, it was getting. cold.
Yes.
And we said,
Yes.
"We don't think we want to go."
Okay, let's
So we
resume,
went up
take our
to
seats.
We went to Rome, we went up, everywhere, no problems.
Everyone,
Back, no problems.
Okay.
81 in Upper Front Street.
Tom, were there any questions from people out in Zoom land?
No.
So they're either all asleep, uninterested, or I'm doing an amazing job. Oh, boy. Okay.
My head is exploding with all the details.
We're good out here.
I'm glad to hear it. Thank you. I get into sometimes perhaps more detail than is warranted, but one of the goals that I've had, and I think I say this even at the beginning of these series, whenever I begin the introduction of the 4 lectures, is to give us a perspective not only on the events that take place. That's easy. What I'm really trying to do is to bring out more clearly how complicated and difficult these things are, and how literally, for say, the invasion of Salerno, every single person involved has a specific task for which they're responsible to complete. And recognizing that in the course of conflict, people are going to die or be disabled, or equipment is going to fail to function. Now, let me give you just a quick example of an article I saw today, and then I'll get back into this because I can conclude this next part in about a half hour. It was an article on the military preparedness of Canada. Now, we think of our neighbors to the north as obviously a smaller population, but still a vibrant Western economy, and their per capita income, I think, ranks somewhere around 12 per capita. But their military spending is somewhere around the 1.2% of their GDP, which I think is a lousy comparison, but there it is. And they're talking about spending more money on defense over the next 10 years. But when you start looking at the numbers that are offered in this article, considering the size of Canada, they have in their armed forces, they lack somewhere around 16 to 20,000 recruits. So they can't find personnel. So even if they had the weapons, they don't have the personnel. Another article I saw related to the United States, and that is, and again, you can really parse these polls out the way you want, but I think the general projection is important. That in a poll of whether or not military-aged people, because now we're talking about men and women, not just men, who would be willing to fight for the United States in a major conflict was somewhere around 25%. That means the majority would not. Now, obviously, circumstances can change. I'm sure that if you started polling Americans, and as actually was done in the 1930s, and who wants to get involved, there's a different issue involved of saying, we don't want any part of that European conflict, okay? But when we've been attacked at Pearl Harbor, the recruiting stations were filled with volunteers. So there's a different dynamic in play. And the same has been said about Germany. A poll indicated that the more Americans in Germany, the less likely the German population would defend itself. It's an interesting dynamic. And we also know that Germany's economy, while struggling mightily for a whole variety of reasons, has nowhere near the military capacity that one would think a modern, economically powerful nation should have or could have. I've read articles that said they had to hire civilian helicopters to train pilots for the military. That they have maybe 1 or 2 squadrons of fighter aircraft that are combat capable. That's a minimal number of aircraft. They have no Navy to speak of. Their tank units are such that the resistance they had to sending tanks to Ukraine was great, and they said they would only do it if the United States sent them, even though Ukraine is on their border. And if you're truly afraid that the Russians are going to keep coming, you'd say, I don't know that we want our tanks going to Ukraine. Or if we're going to send them, we better start building some new ones. So none of that has happened so far. When you look at the dynamic of World War II, and one of you mentioned about casualties and losses that have taken place within a short period of time compared to what we see in modern conflicts, the difference in attitude and approach is very important. And I'm going to discuss this a little bit more, and I'm going to pose a series of questions to all of you at the end of today that I want you to think about before next week. And then I'll bring them back up. It's not necessarily something where we have to discuss it, because I find that that isn't the purpose of what I'm doing. The purpose is to just let you think it through yourselves. Figure out where you want to take it, choose whatever element is involved. Now, Fifth Army landed at Salerno, and one of the questions comes up is why there? And part of the reason was it wasn't too far from Naples. And Dieppe had shown that you can't attack a port directly without getting more than a bloody nose, because Dieppe was a disaster. So you needed to have a facility, a place where you could land relatively safely, but you had to be close enough to a port that you could take it and turn it into a useful site for landing supplies and reinforcements and so on. And indeed, when you look at the Normandy beachhead and you look at where things are and you say, well, there's Cherbourg, it's way off to one side. And then you have these other small coastal towns with no port facilities. Why there? Now, why not get closer to a port? And that has to do with expectations and planning. As the Germans withdrew from the Salerno beachhead, now facing a dire threat from Montgomery, finally getting up to join with the Fifth Army and forcing the Germans back, and they recognized they can't prevent the Allies from staying in Italy. The question is, how far can you keep them from Rome and northern Italy? Remember, northern Italy was the strategic enclave that Hitler wanted to protect most seriously in all of this. So as the Germans withdraw, what would you do? You'd wreck anything of use to your opponent. So you blow up bridges and culverts, you destroy factories that might be used for things, you wreck the ports as much as you can so shipping can't come in and be used. Oh, but what if you destroy water supplies and fuel storage? Then the Allies have to support the population. They've got to provide the food and water and electricity. And that is going to divert resources that otherwise might be used at the front. So harsh as it seems, that was part of the German philosophy. And they were executing the same philosophy when they were withdrawing from the Soviet Union boundaries into Ukraine and so on and so forth. Fortunately, the Allies realized that this was likely going to be the behavior of the Germans. So in regard, that means you have to provide enormous engineering facility capabilities, men with talent and organizational abilities, and the material to rebuild. And indeed, for the most part, they're able to do that. But nonetheless, the road networks are awful. And every little stream, every little culvert, every river during this period of time is now almost reaching flood stages because the rain is starting to fall. And it's falling in a much heavier degree than that had been anticipated or expected based on previous histories. So now you've got much more flooding. And getting across a flooded river plain or getting across a raging torrent can be really very, very difficult. I don't know if any of you have ever been out backpacking. I can just remember a scenario we had where there was a raging torrent and we looked at that thing and said, we're not going across there. We're going to go upstream and we're going to try to find a place where it's broadened out so there's less depth and we can walk across with a little less current knocking us off our feet. Okay. It's just a natural human endeavor. The Eighth Army was driving north, and as they drove north, they were taking some minor ports along the way. But again, you'll notice in this slide, this is relatively open ground. But now you're hitting the mountains. And for any of you who've traveled in Italy and been on either the East Coast or the West Coast, you'll realize those mountains come almost right down to the oceans or the seas. And in some places, they're simply cliff-like, where there's just no way you're going to do anything other than as a single person scramble along. And that at your own peril. Amphibious assaults are used at different times, but the Germans are still very effective around places like Termoli here, and they stall the British advances. They're forcing them into fighting over very short distances. There's very little you can do unless you have artillery and mortars and things of that sort. But the important critical part for the Allies was that they were able to clear this town, Foggia, where they built up a whole series of air forces and eventually put the 15th Air Force there. The 15th Air Force is a strategic bombing force, which will be used to attack the Balkan areas, including Ploesti, and some of the southern German areas that were not readily accessible from England. So they're gaining ground. They're beginning to make progress. Montgomery stays in command, but now he's got to go back to England in order to help for the invasion of Normandy. The weather continues to deteriorate. Now notice the time frame here. This is December. Naples has fallen, but the Allies are still far south of Rome. And you're getting into terrible winter conditions, mud, rain, freezing cold, and a road network that is deteriorating rapidly. Remember when I talked about the Eastern Front, we had a thing called the Raputitsa, which is the mud season, and everything gets bogged down. Well, that was happening here too. So trucks on which Americans and the British were very reliant for transport aren't making any headway. The Germans, on the other hand, still have a large number of mules and horses, and they know how to manage them, whereas the Allies don't. But the Allies are beginning to grab mules and less few horses and donkeys and things and use them to bring supplies into the mountain regions. But we're not used to breaking horses. Eventually, they make their way up in mid-January, late January to the Rapido. And near the Rapido, don't worry about this slide, I'm breaking it down. A number of things begin to happen. The Germans have set up defensive lines which have slowed the advance of the Allies to this particular point. And in the southern portion along the coast, the initial territory that you see in this lower segment is not too bad, but these little lines that you see here represent mountain areas. And this is one of the major roads, but notice it's right on the coast. There's very little that's up through here. There is another roadway through here, which you'll see in a little bit. But most importantly, even if you're on this road, you're cut off by the mountains here. You're well within targeting range. So even as the British try to advance in this area, they make very limited progress. And it's even worse here for the Second Corps here. This is the American Corps, all right? And they're trying to blast their way across this because there's another major route leading up the Liri Valley. And this Monte Cassino right here becomes infamous for this particular conflict across this river, the Rapido and the Garigliano, which becomes a brutal area for the Americans to contest. And if you'll see here, this is all January, Allied attacks beaten back, as you'll see down here. See these arrows that are rebuffed? These weren't feints. They hoped to get across because then you've got the Liri Valley where you have some less mountainous terrain and you can maybe drive forward more, even though you've got on your flanks mountain areas. But they can't make it. Some of the regiments here begin to make some progress, but very quickly they're rebuffed by the Germans on high ground and they're forced back. They don't stay where they are. As you get later in the month, again, there's another attempt to get across. And as reinforcements have flowed into Italy, sucking in more and more Allied forces, you begin also to suck in German forces. So eventually, the numbers that we'll see towards the end of this lecture today reflect the commitment that is made in the Italian theater just to get this far. And these books that are up here on Cassino and so on really give you a infantryman's view of what it was like from either side, what this fighting was like. The Allies are stopped. They're beginning to think, how do we get out of this? We're stuck against this fortified line. We've been trying for over a month to get through it. It's absolutely brutal. We have sea power. We can land anywhere. Why not use that to get around these fortifications, disrupt them? Think of in Korea, you know, you have that fighting across the Korean peninsula, and then MacArthur lands at Incheon. All right. Do you think he learned that on his own? No, he'd been practicing that in World War II. He saw what happened here and so on. So the Allies say, gee, Italy has formally surrendered, even though they're useless to either side. They're nothing more than a dependent at this point. And the Germans, you know, they're down there fighting us off as we try to creep up this boot. So they got to be weak somewhere. So Churchill, having designated Italy as the soft underbelly, which it turned out not to be the case, says, well, land further up. That should work, and we should be able to throw the Germans out. So, sounds great. Let's do it. So, Operation Shingle. They land on January 22nd. Look at how long they're stuck there. Okay. Churchill tells us we have a whale stuck on the beach. Now, the reasons this happened have been criticized at the time and in histories. That when the landing took place here at Anzio and Rome was up further here, if you drove out to Ortuna, you began to cut one of the major supply routes to the German 10th Army down fighting on this line of Cassino and forced them to withdraw. But the forces that are occurring here, even though this is relatively open ground through here, has mountains up through here. So once you begin to penetrate, the commanding general at the time, Lucas, says, how far can I go safely? Because the Germans are going to react at some point. And if I'm stretched too far, what will happen? Will we be penetrated at some particular point and the beachhead collapsed and our army destroyed, or not? Again, Lucas was not considered at all incompetent, nor unaggressive. But as the general in charge, even though he's given instructions as to what is to be his ultimate goal, he decides that he's going to turn up a little bit short and consolidate his beachhead, build up his forces so that he can muster a sufficient amount of material and men to complete his mission. But in the interim, this costs time. And when it costs time, the Germans react, and they react very quickly. The penetration that you see, to put it in perspective, is that the Anzio beachhead is here where the 6th Corps is, all right? Notice this is 30 miles. So from here to here is about 60 miles. It doesn't look too far, except that what this map doesn't show you is the awful terrain that has to be covered. And the German response is sufficient. And as Robert pointed out, air power still was not a big factor here. This became all an issue related to ground pounders. Even the Navy could only support out to a certain distance. So if you take this as 30 miles, this depth is 15, you can't provide a lot of naval support out there. So this depends on the artillery you have in here. And if your German artillery is out here, it can make that hell on wheels or off wheels at the time. Yes, Robert.
Where was Anzio Annie located?
The Germans had 2 huge guns. One was Anzio Annie, and the other the name escapes me, and they were rail guns. So they brought them down from Rome and they ensconced them in tunnels. And they would roll out and fire these enormous shells into the beachheads and then retreat back into the tunnels. And because of the time frame we're talking about, weather was awful. So aircraft, even if they were there, often couldn't fly because they couldn't see what they were doing. So a whole lot of reasons why this happened. And as you can see, that this defense line only occurs late and is a new defense line called the Caesar line. So the Germans are already preparing more defenses further if they realize that their front is broken. So on the 5th, and I'm just going to go through a couple of these very quickly, the Germans again begin to attack. Here's the initial line, intermediate line, the final beachhead. The Germans are counterattacking and forcing the Allies back. And when you read accounts, such as in some of these books, about what was going on, it was scary for the US forces that are in here. They're really beginning to wonder. And so it emphasized in part Lucas's main concern. Had he gone further, he would have stretched his lines further. The German counterattacks already threaten this. Now look down here, this scale of miles, right? That's 4 miles, 4-8. Not very far, okay? So when you look at that, you could say, was Lucas, you know, shouldn't he have gone all the way up to Cisterna and even further and to Ortona and so on and so forth? The answer is, well, if he had, what might have happened? This gives you an idea of how fast the Germans were able to muster units. Now, many of these are regiment size. When you see these 3 little spikes on top as opposed to that, this is a regiment, this is a division. But the point is that the Germans were able to bring down considerable forces and hem in this perimeter and assault it at a number of different points with fair degrees of success. Now, at times, as the Germans penetrated further, naval gunfire could provide additional support. So again, without the Navy, this could have been a disaster. Both sides are taking a severe beating. It's now deep into winter. The Allies have been struggling, and at Monte Cassino in particular, any attacks that they make across the Rapido and the Garigliano are being beaten back. The casualties are enormous. The suffering is enormous, even if you're not fighting, because you're in, you know, trenches and foxholes, and it's dirty and you're wet and you're cold and so on and so forth. Looking up on those hills, remember what I said before, you know the enemy's up there. He can see you. You can't do anything about it. And on top of one of the most prominent parts, overlooking so much of the Allied line, is this Benedictine Abbey. There was great pressure brought from the front line commanders to the Air Force through the Army, because the Army Air Force was still under Army command at the time, unlike the British that had a separate department for the Royal Air Force. Said, listen, you got to take out the Abbey. I'm sure the Germans are occupying it. They're using it for observation, and we just got to beat it up. And the Germans said, we're not occupying it. And the Abbey the abbot, and the Germans aren't in here, said, no. We got to take it out. It's just too much of a dominating feature. Now think about it from this perspective. Let's suppose for a minute that the Germans were there inside the Abbey. How much elevation did that add to what they could see? Well, you might get up another 50, 75 feet here. Is that going to make a huge difference over what you can see down in the valleys? And if they're not occupying it, and you bomb it, you have a political problem that you just wrecked this old beautiful abbey. The pictures of the interior before it was bombed are just extraordinary. And even if you bomb the daylights out of it and you kill a bunch of Germans who might be in there, how different is this from that? How much of a difference in observation? You can't blow the whole mountaintop off. I mean, you got to lower the whole mountain if you want to get rid of the observation capabilities. You can't do that. So anyway, when the bombers went over and pummeled this abbey into ruins, the morale temporarily increased among the frontline troops. Yay, look what our guys can do. But the next assault didn't accomplish a whole lot. And it wasn't, as you can see here, shortly after the bombing takes place, the Allies again try to attack. The 4th Indian Division, which is not American Indian, sorry, bad joke, but anyway, make some ground as they often had, and then again, they're beaten back. These contour lines you see here represent 50 meters in difference. And the distance between these, if you put it in terms of the mile marker or the kilometer marker, tells you that, say, between here and here, you might go up 50 meters horizontally, but you're going up 50 meters vertically. So you're at a 45-degree angle. I don't know if you've ever tried doing that. Stairs aren't anywhere near that. Okay. So that's very steep. And as you'll see here, they're so steep that this is a roadway that has to use switchbacks in order to try to get up there. No progress. So bombing it didn't do a whole lot. So when you get through March and April, there's very little progress that's made on any front. We're building up resources. We are inflicting damage on the Germans, but the Germans are holding through very, very well until this particular time frame, in which finally the Allies are able to break out of Anzio. And their instructions are to drive up here. See this main road, right? And here, cut this road, because that'll unhinge the supply to the Germans here. And if you get here, they won't be able to withdraw easily. They'd have to go here and then go this way. But if these guys are falling back, these roads are going to be jammed. And if the roads are jammed, that's Target City, right? If your aircraft can get there because the weather's improving in May, you can obliterate these long columns that are snaking their way up these roadways through central Italy. Remember how mountainous that is. The only flat areas are right at the coast where you might make some speed. And even a simple thing like a bridge going out there is of much more difficulty to fix than it is if you have flat terrain around it. So they're making progress. They're breaking out. 2 days to finally force the Germans back. And the initial thought was to go in this direction. But instructions come that maybe we should go in this direction because what's up here? The city of Rome, right? The first major capital city of our opponent. And if we take that, think of the morale boost that has. Notice that this is May 1944. Clark knows what's coming. He knows that the Normandy invasion had been planned for May. He doesn't know that it's going to take place necessarily on June 6th when it actually occurs. But he's been involved in understanding all this. So he's finally seeing his armies get on the march They're going to beat the Germans. They now are forcing the Germans back. They know they're going to win this portion of the fight. But instead, he heads up to Rome, and the Germans can escape. Again, the question arises, was this purely Mark Clark's ego? Was it because the Italian front was now being relegated to secondary importance with the buildup in England? It was nothing more than an attempt to siphon off German forces so there would be weakness in northern France, and perhaps this would help the Soviet Union, Stalin on the Eastern Front? Or was this just ego? Well, ego clearly played a role, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it was only ego that played a role. And taking Rome did mean that that whole intersection of road networks like Gettysburg in the Civil War was a place where a lot of roads come together, and if you control that, you control those roads. And that can be very, very important. This gives you an idea of what happened from June 22nd, June 5th, as we've written here. And you'll see that initially when they're landing, 36,000 men are going to be landing here at Salerno and so on. But over time, the buildup to the point of the breakout gets to 150,000. And notice the Germans are very close in number. Now, where are they outdone? Look at the number of aircraft. Huge number difference there. But look at the casualties too. About even. Now, the Allies can take that. The Germans, they're beginning to scratch the bottom of their manpower pool as well. So it's getting to be difficult for them in a very important way. But this gives you an idea of how the Italian campaign was going to finish up. And this just shows that overall strength that varied from time to time, but eventually, by the time you get towards the end of the Italian campaign, you're dealing with nearly 250,000 men. Look at that number of tanks and airplanes. I mean, it's just phenomenal numbers. It's hard to even comprehend what it means today. Okay, two key conferences take place shortly afterward, or at the end of 1943, and I'm only going to mention them briefly, and then we're going to stop because I want to either allow time for other questions, or I want to set the stage for what's coming. The Cairo conference takes place in Cairo, obviously, in November, and in this particular situation, let me just do this. You'll notice who shows up. This guy, Chiang Kai-shek. So he's come all the way from China. He's flown all the way across to Cairo to meet with Roosevelt and Churchill. What are they meeting for? What's the purpose behind their meeting? One is this. We want, the Japanese have driven up Burma, taken Burma, Thailand, Malaysia, that whole bit. They've driven up almost to the borders of India. And the British and the troops they have mustered there have barely been able to hold the line, but they're beginning to gain enough strength, and the Japanese are getting stretched enough that it appears feasible to take northern Burma back. And if that comes back, then there's the possibility of opening the roads to China to get more supplies across by road, because they've been flying them over and they haven't had enough aircraft to do that adequately. And again, by pressing down the coast, they might be able to divert more Japanese resources to that area and weaken them somewhere else. Remember, it's always a matter of dissipation of strength. They're going to also send B-29s that are finally coming off the production lines. we have by this time really geared up well for B-17s and B-24s, the so-called Liberator. The B-17 is the famous flying fortress that we've all heard about, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we come next week. But the important part was that neither the B-24s nor the B-17s had the range that was being built into the B-29s. And if bases could be established in China, in the part still controlled by Chiang Kai-shek, then B-29s could be used strategically against the Japanese homeland. They could fly, they had the range. Now, logistics were another issue, but that was part of the intent. They also discussed territorial claims, including the issue of Korea and what would happen when the war ended for the Japanese industries in China, and reaffirming the unconditional surrender of Japan. These were of great importance to Chiang Kai-shek, because who was he fighting in China? He was fighting the communists as well, not just the Japanese. So in terms of it, if you go back into this time era and you try to put yourself in the mindset of people who had been dealing with the threat of the ideology of communism and how it had been growing up in a lot of different areas, including the United States and Britain and France and so on, it was seen as a real ideological threat that would undermine the values that we said we held dear in the West. So with him fighting Mao, even though they had a semblance of a truce, but they got at each other whenever the opportunity came, that he wanted to have enough superiority that he could crush the communists after the Japanese were defeated. So this linkage for him was very important. Now, the other important part of this unconditional surrender of Japan carried another element to it that did not exist with Germany. What was that? The status of the emperor. What was the status of the emperor in Japan?
God.
Yeah, descended from divinity. So if you say unconditional surrender, what does that say about your whole framework? Our leaders descended from the gods. How can we surrender that? I mean, that's just nuts. It's unfathomable. Okay. All right. Then they flew on, Roosevelt and Churchill, to Tehran, which at that time was controlled by the British. And they made another series of decisions. And this time, Stalin was able to make the journey because it was close enough, and they had swept the Germans out of the Caucasus regions, freed up the Black Sea, taken back the Crimea and everything else. So they had a good transit route, and he could afford the time off. But in that particular situation, here's another interesting element. What was Tito's ideology? Was he a Democrat? I mean, writ small. He was a communist. All right. He had been stronger than the Mensheviks. I think they were called, or that doesn't sound right. The Mensheviks were a Bolshevik group, but it's something like that. Begins with an M. Anyway, he had been fighting not only the Germans, he'd been fighting another opposition group. My apologies to anyone with Yugoslav descent. They wanted to bring Turkey in. I talked about that, talked about the invasion, talked about that. Regular consultations about the Allies. Post-war Germany. What was to happen? They were confident enough now, especially with the Casablanca conference that said unconditional surrender, that we are going to win. This is just getting into 1944 now. We're going to win. We're no longer not going to lose. That 1 year made a huge difference. What do we want to do with Germany? And there was great discussion about that without any firm commitment. That came later, I think, at the Yalta Conference. United Nations. Well, it's like the League of Nations. Let's try again. Okay, see if we can't get everybody together and kumbaya, peace will reign. Okay, without recognition of all the ideological differences that are going to occur. But this was like Wilson's 14 points. This was to allow all the nations to get together and sort out their problems, and we'll ignore the failure of the League of Nations. Again, try to convince Stalin to join. And Stalin basically is saying to them, if I join, what do I get out of it? Okay, why should I fight them? You know, you're going to beat them on your own. So what do you need me for? But if I'm going to do that, you got to give me something. Okay. So think about that happening at that negotiating table. And notice here, status of Poland and the Baltic states. Well, remember, Britain went to war because they had said, because the Germans invaded Poland, they were declaring war on Germany. Germany didn't declare war on Britain first. All right. Britain issued an ultimatum, said you have 3 days to get out of Poland, and then we won't, you know, declare war. And then Hitler said, "Are you kidding me? You're going to try to defend Poland? You can't even get there from here." Nonetheless. And we talked about what happened in Warsaw with the two different factions at work and the two different Polish governments that existed. Stalin has the upper hand in all of this. He knows it, all right? So he can leave the status open to satisfy this guy. Churchill, notice he doesn't look as happy. Isn't that telling? He's saying, oh, this isn't going well. Okay. All right. Questions that I'm going to pose very quickly are these. I want you to think about this. And there's a reason for bringing this up, because it isn't just about strategic bombing. It's about the totality of war. And as Tom and I were talking about earlier, before the session started, what is the nature of war? What are the obligations of the governments that have agreed to war? What kind of resources are mustered? And how are they to be utilized to end the conflict? And how does one end the conflict? What is the ultimate issue? As Clausewitz has said, and has been repeated ad nauseum almost, that war is an extension of politics by other means. He has left in a way unexplained exactly what is meant by politics. And if, as I talked about the very beginning of these lectures way back, there's a clear difference in the ideological structures that existed within the combatants, what their ultimate goals were, and how they conducted war against their opponents based on those ideological differences. So think of this just as an example. The way the Germans conducted themselves on the Eastern Front was very different in great measure from the way it was conducted on the Western Front, especially after the invasion of Normandy, but you saw it also in North Africa and you saw it in Italy. The nature of the fighting that took place against the Empire of Japan carried a very different construct. Part of the differences came from above. The German commanders, and therefore all the soldiers on the Eastern Front, were given specific instructions which were not applied against the British, French, and American forces. The Japanese treated any contestant with a level of brutality that was consistent with their ethos, not necessarily as a specific set of instructions from above, but as cultural behavior. The same was true in the United States in conflicts with Native Americans. So there's a certain level of brutality that occurs, which is more than just the idea of killing someone. And how does that change, or how has it changed when we look at this question specifically of strategic bombing, but more generally in how we conduct war? I'll leave it there. I will stick around. If anyone in Zoom land or here has questions, by all means, feel free. And I thank you again for your attention and tolerance for all of this. Thank you.
Did Clark go to Rome on his own, or was he instructed to go to Rome?
He basically went there on his own. The idea was that his primary job was to try to destroy the German forces. But he knew that the invasion of Normandy was coming, and he wanted his troops, all of the troops in Italy, to be recognized as having achieved something of great importance. So operationally, militarily, maybe not the best choice, but man, when Rome looks like it's within your grasp and the Germans are not going to defend it, how could you not go there? You just, man, that's a draw that would have been very hard to resist.
Yeah, at
Yes.
what point are Roosevelt and Churchill getting different views of the post-war recolonization? Because Roosevelt essentially came up with an idea of self-determination, and France and England had all these colonies
Right.
that they would like to reclaim.
That's an excellent question. It actually goes back even further. If you go back to Wilson's 14 points at the end of World War I. So there were very great differences about the importance of colonies to your wealth and your economic power, and through your economic power, your military power. If Britain had to give up all its colonies, then they were going to become second rate because they didn't have the resources. Their power was an imperial power. France felt similarly. They had taken a huge beating in World War I, and then they collapsed in World War II to the point where they were, as a nation, putting aside de Gaulle, second, almost third rate. I mean, they collapsed faster than Italy did, but that's because the Germans defended Italy. And de Gaulle insisted that they retain their colonies, which ultimately led to the Indochina War, their loss at Dien Bien Phu in '54, and then American involvement thereafter, which got ideologically very complicated. But economically, remember that de Gaulle also had Algeria to deal with. Algeria was actually considered by many, especially senior levels, as part of France. It's like Hawaii, even though it's over there, it's us. It's our country. So when the Algerian revolts occurred and eventually France had to withdraw, the ministers in France were threatened with assassination, and they weren't kidding about it. You know, this wasn't just social media saying, oh, I'm going to kill somebody, right? No, they meant it. There's even a movie that was made about an attempt to assassinate him.
Day of the Jackal.
Day of the Jackal, exactly. Thank you, Robert. And that's based on history. You know, it's fabricated to a degree, but it has its foundation reality where somebody wanted to take him out. And there was nearly a revolt on the part of the army on that as well. Yes. Anyone else? All right, well, thank you again for your attention. Please take a few moments to look at that last slide. When Tom sends it around, you know, I don't expect anyone to go through 2 more hours of this stuff, but go to that last slide and just start asking yourself questions, and then try to provide your own answers and extend that to where we are literally at this moment of time.
You're gonna expand the issue of ethical to is war ethical, not just strategic boundary.
Well, that's an excellent question, Robert. And to some extent, it's been a historical issue. If you even go back to Thomas Aquinas and talk about just war, Or you go back even before him to Urban when he calls for the Crusades and things of this nature. The idea of what is permitted ethically. And you could even go to the Ten Commandments if you want to go that
That
far.
was through the prism of the dominance of a particular religious belief.
Well, that particular was, but remember that a lot of the foundations of the West was based on a Judeo-Christian ethos. And if you look at, and I haven't done any deep work on this, if you look at Islam, or if you look at what was happening in Japan at the time, then the concept of war takes on a very different coloring and a different nature to it. So all of those influences play a role, but it's worth our consideration.
All the participants were signatories to the Geneva Conventions.
No, the Japanese, I think, were not, though at the beginning of the war, they said they would adhere to it, but they didn't. Frankly, they said, who cares, you know? I mean, people don't matter. The way they treated their own troops, if you read the biography or autobiography of, I think it was Saburo Sakai, who was a famous Japanese pilot, had an enormous record among the Japanese. And you read about his training. He got to the point where his training was so brutal, he thought about cutting his own tongue off and dying, you know, just bleeding to death, because he says it's just brutal beyond belief. But that's the way they treated everybody. You just didn't matter. It's not that people didn't become sad when somebody died. That's a different issue. The question was, did it matter in the large scheme of things? And that's why Hitler, and I think it was the Swansea Conference in 42 when they started organizing the Holocaust, you know, the death camps, was you serve the state or else. And that was the communism as well under Stalin. If you didn't serve the state, you didn't count for anything. That's why the Holodomor, as it was called, with millions of Ukrainians dying of starvation, was justifiable. You know, that old French comment, you know, you got to break some eggs to make an omelet. They didn't worry about how many eggs got broken. That's very different from the values that were driving us, especially people like Roosevelt, who was very progressive and liberal in his thinking. That's where the New Deal came from, you know. Otherwise, we got to take care of people. You know? We're going to spend resources to do it. Yeah. Yes.
I was just gonna come up and ask you later on,